Ga de kandidaat halen. Hallo. May I take a picture if you don't mind?
The first of many.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is it in this room?
We will stay here. Okay. Normally we are opposite the corridor, which is 70 out. Yes, and the order is quite high.
Okay. Fine. No. Just practical. Yeah. I have to pack my stuff or not.
No, we can just relax.
Okay.
You may take a seat. Thank you.
Hereby, I open this academic ceremony, in which Orrego Wennick will defend the academic thesis, Understanding Shifts in Climate Policy, the Role of Ideas in Shaping EU Climate Policy, 2005-2024. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. Resource.
Thank you, Pro-Rector, thank you, Assessment Committee, and thank you, dear supervisors, for giving me the opportunity to present my dissertation about understanding shifts in climate policy, the role of ideas in shaping EU climate policy from 2005 to 2024. As you all know, global warming has huge societal implications. Everything from flooding, forest fires, conflicts, biodiversity problems, and displacements. So it has huge implications, and it has also led to climate policy growing into a distinct policy area. The EU is often considered as a front-runner when it comes to climate policy. And the EU also founded the ETS, which is still the biggest, and it's the first cap and trade system in the world for carbon emissions. So you trade carbon emissions in this system, which is indeed what global warming is about. The ETS covers roughly 40% of all carbon emissions in the EU. In 2027, the estimation is that it will cover 70% of EU's carbon emissions. So it's a very important instrument and also a focus for this study. So, when we look at the EU ETS, originally in the first trading periods, trading period 1 and 2 from 2005 to 2012, simplified it here a bit, but it covered energy-intensive industries and power sector. Then, in its third trade period, from 2013 to 2020, aviation within the EU was added. The first original ones are still kept. Heating and carbon capture storage was added, plus the production of various chemicals and materials. In its fourth trading period, which we are currently in now, maritime transport was added last year. So this is more of a sort of expanding into sort of international sphere. Equally, CBAM is already in its transitional phase, but will go into full effect next year. CBAM stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and basically means that you adjust some of the imports in the, for the products covered by CBAM at the borders to adjust for the carbon price. So this adds this external dimension and a new, sort of new part of the EU ETS. Aviation outside of the EU can also be added around 2027, but that depends on international agreements. So that date is not certain, that's why I put the question mark there. And then buildings and transport will be added in 2027. So, EU ETS and the shifts create a very interesting puzzle. And with this image, I try to show some of the major reforms, not all, but just some of them and how they also connect to the development of the EU ETS price. So you can see here in the beginning, in the first trading periods, how there was no EU-wide cap. And eventually the price went down to €1. So that's the first, see the first there, red circle. That's just before then the EU-wide cap was presented, and then the price stabilized and went up again above €20. And we can see slowly, surely how the price was going down. Number of factors contributed to that. Of course, there was an economic crisis in 2009, but there was also a sort of lack of trading here also, of course, on the market, lack of liquidity. And that's when we went into the set-aside backloading debate, and eventually there was a backloading agreement to sort of not put some EU ETS allowances on the market. And eventually in the fourth trading period, this was even further then worked on, and EU ETS allowance could be easier deleted from the market. And you can see right there also the Green Deal, and the prices started going up again after the fourth trading period. And then there was a CBAM agreement, and then the prices almost approached €100. They were around 90 for quite some time. So you can see here how the market dynamic of this instrument and also some of these policies are intertwined. So this is a puzzle that we will look at here, and I also want to say that this is an article-based PhD, and we will get into that more later on, but I have 2 articles published, and one in European Policy Analysis and one in European Foreign Affairs Review, which was published actually fittingly enough this month, so just before the defense today. So a bit on the theoretical background and the theoretical review. So you start off by, I should maybe also mention the question of the thesis. So question of the thesis is basically how can we explain the ideas behind these climate shifts, these policy shifts. And first to the literature review, I want to look at how the possible approaches to explaining these shifts in the EU ETS. So what are the different theoretical explanations to these shifts? So first, on international regimes approach, is the first theory we looked at. And international regimes approach, basically simplifying it, that it explains EU ETS as a spillover from the Kyoto Protocol. And then we looked at some of the European integration theories, like liberal intergovernmentalism, basically explains EU ETS as the economic rationale of the bigger member states, France, Germany, UK, and how they push the EU ETS in a certain direction. Neo-functionalism, you can see how the supranational European institutions push for more ambition in the EU ETS. Basically, European Commission with strong support of the European Parliament that pushes for more ambition. And then the multi-level governance theories. You could see, for example, individual companies like BP or individual organizations like Euroelectric that push for this more ambitious EU ETS and climate policy. Then we turned to ideational theories and looked at discursive institutionalism, paradigm shifts, myth-building capacities, and we found that it was a bit lacking. It was underdeveloped, let's say. We felt that there was a gap to fill, and for that reason then paradigm shifts, which is also mentioned as a typically good theory to use for technical instruments, already mentioned in Peter Hall's seminal work on paradigm shifts. So for the analytical approach to the study, paradigm shifts was chosen. We looked specifically at 2 different pieces of work. So Peter Hall's work from 1993, the seminal work sort of, on paradigm shifts, about how policy shifts in macroeconomic policy in the UK take place over 1.5 decades. And then added to this, the work from Baikön, Konsemko, and Mitchell from 2015 on how and why do policy paradigms change, and does it matter? This was on energy policy, and builds on Hall's work. So to simplify, to simplify it, you can see here how the different levels and orders in these works sort of fit together. So they build very much on each other. So in Peter Hall's work, you have 3 different orders that sort of identify a full paradigm shift. So it's a gradual thing. So you first come to the first order. We have basic changes in the basic settings. Then you have changes in the instruments, which you then achieve the second order. And the third order in the policy, the hierarchy of goals have changed. And if you achieve all of them, then a paradigm shift has taken place. And then in Kern, Konsemko, and Mitchell, they added institutions to show how ideas then get embedded in the institutions, and also to allow for more analysis of these sort of incremental changes. Kern, Konsemko, and Mitchell was mostly used for the first case study on the UTS, and for the second one on CBAM, Peter Hall was used more. So then we have established an analytical framework. Then the next step is to have a codebook or a benchmark to then compare and see, have you moved from one paradigm to another? And then climate paradigms, international climate paradigms, that has been presented, for example, by Hayden in 2015 in the book When Green Growth Is Not Enough, were used. Adopted the first paradigm here a bit, he called it business as usual. Adopted it based on Drusek and his book on the politics of the earth, to call it Prometheanism, Growth Unlimited. And then EM, ecological modernization and sufficiency paradigm. And as you can see here on the graph, try to make it very clear then that PGU sort of prioritizes economic growth over climate action. EM is somewhere in the middle, and it's often called also the green growth paradigm, to sort of show that economic growth and climate action go hand in hand. And then the sufficiency paradigm, which then does the opposite and prioritizes climate action more than economic growth. It believes in the restrictions of resources of the earth. The boundaries need to be respected. A bit on the anti-globalization side of things as well. And it's a big church, the sufficiency paradigm, but also the degrowth belongs in there. But it's not per definition anti-growth. It just prioritizes climate action higher. So then for the research design, for case selection, we selected the UTS, and then building on the UTS, you have CBAM. And there was also a study on EUTS and paradigm shifts in the UTS from 2009. So we chose to start in 2009 to sort of build on that study on paradigm shifts, and went on to study it until 2022. My article was published right around then. And then in this study, we identified that CBAM partially led the EU towards the sufficiency paradigm. So then the idea was to do the second study on CBAM, and also the fact of this being sort of a trade policy instrument, one of its kind, could lead to interesting insights. And we used a mixed method, so it was a qualitative study with document analysis, both primary and secondary. And we added to this also quantitative elements, but the basis is qualitative. But the quantitative element was to search for certain words according to these benchmarks in primary, especially primary documents. And then for the second study, which was done a bit later, was basically the CBAM process was just finished. There were some parts where we couldn't find documents, and then we decided to also complement with a few semi-structured expert interviews, especially in the commission, to be able to understand more the process there and the policy development. So on the different cases, so the first case is the EUTS case. This one was published in October 2023 in the European Policy Analysis. Conclusion is that paradigm shifts can be observed, that the sort of PGU paradigm is basically in decline from 2009, and that even sufficiency became dominant in 2019, but still with a strong presence of EM, so there's some stickiness to the EM paradigm. You could also see over this period how adaptations take place. So in the interpretive framework, it often sounds a bit different. So around 2009, economic growth was still prioritized, but when you look at the objectives of policy, it's more on the EM side, even if some of it was on the PGU side in the interpretive framework. I have a table here just to show an example of one of the elements in the article, how we sort of summarize the different changes at the conclusions part of the article. And I put the red square around here, 2019, 2022, to show how sufficiency sort of comes through in all the different levels here. But you can still see, for example, Poland being in the PGU did not want to endorse the 2050 net zero target, etc. But this is the way we worked on summarizing it. There's also graphs. I will show a graph for the other case study later on, but also clear that European Parliament or European Commission with the support of European Parliament was pushing things in a sort of sufficiency direction. There's some exceptions. There's, for example, the backloading agreement where initially the Parliament voted no, and later on we see this also sort of same tendency from the CBAM case. So on the CBAM case, this was studied this month in European Foreign Affairs Review. I adapted the climate paradigms to sort of make it possible to analyze it against as a trade policy instrument. So in these paradigms, I searched specifically for 3 different dimensions. So the unilateralism trade dimension, competitiveness dimension, and also this north-south justice dimension that was very much covered also in the discussions, and still is when it comes to CBAM. There was an article coming out just a few weeks ago about this north-south dimension and how it affects weaker economies. So in this case study, you can see sort of a development towards sufficiency during the legislative process. More and more suggestions were taking board, especially on the north-south justice approach to make sure that weaker economies and third world would find more support from the EU in also adapting to CBAM. And European Parliament strongly contributed to this movement. So here, instead, we also have tables equal for the other one, but we focus more on, just to show an example of how we did the sort of complementing documentary quantitative analysis of primary documents. So here, it's verified from the qualitative study. You also see in the quantitative that we moved more towards sufficiency for north-south justice. That's the dark gray one. And the light gray one is then globalization. And then for competitiveness, it shows a bit more complex picture. Even if the impact assessment for CBAM says it would lead to less economic growth, this was a bit lacking from the debate, which I also studied. So even if it's already there in the beginning, it did not really come through in the sort of political debates that much. And so for the general conclusion, my conclusion is that EM is dominant then, if you take up these cases together and the background studies, but with movement towards sufficiency, especially there around 2019 to 2022. And also show that paradigms can coexist. This is also something that several other scholars have concluded, like Oliver and Pemberton in 2004. And so I side with those scholars. And also empirically, we see this East-West divide, how some Eastern countries sometimes join Western coalitions, but the move towards more ambition, push for that, in the Council mostly comes from the Western member states. And we can also see that the main policy entrepreneurs in this is the Commission, but also with support from European Parliament. And my contribution is also here then to better understand future climate policy through ideas. It's not only about crisis or institutional stickiness, but to sort of understand how future policy will develop based on these ideas and these climate paradigms. Thank you so much for your time. I am open for questions, and I believe I've gone over a couple of minutes. I'm sorry for that.
Okay, thanks so much for your presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor Thomas Conselman, who was the chair in international relations here at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, at Maastricht.
Okay, thank you, Ralph. Dear candidate, I would like to commend you on the research you have done, the thesis you have written, and that you have defended so well today. I think you're engaging with a really highly relevant topic that affects us all, and you also show how the EU, as one of the major players in that field, has been moving more towards the sufficiency paradigm over time, even though PGU and EM still basically are around with us. I think the thesis really leads to some relevant insights and also really raises interesting questions, therefore, about the future development of EU climate policies. Now, I have a question that deals with the power of the ideational approach that you have employed in your thesis. So the thesis builds on the claim that we need to understand the changing ideas in order to understand shifts in policy. So your very final bullet point here makes exactly that point. So the dynamic development over time, but also periods of stalemate, and then what you sometimes call in your thesis cascading change that obviously happens at some moments. However, I think you predominantly really focus on mapping these ideas and less on the issue how they trigger change in concrete policies. So I think there is no attempt really in your thesis to show the superiority of this ideational approach vis-a-vis other possible explanatory factors. Yeah? You could think of geopolitical competition, you could think of domestic pressures from business, societal groups, environmental advocates, you could think about the changing interests of major member states. You could also think about these other approaches that you have discussed, like modular governance and so on. So my question really is, could you probe it a bit deeper into the conditions under which a change in idea is going to lead to a change in policies? And linked to that, how can we reject the claim that a skeptic may make that what we see here is basically justifications for policy changes that are, however, triggered by other factors, and where ideas are not really the crucial driver of policy change?
Thank you, dear esteemed opponent, for the question. I think it's a very relevant question, and that I appreciate. I would say that, of course, there's a number of different explanations. I think they can also work in tandem. And of course, if I would do a second PhD, I would be happy also to cover more of those aspects. But indeed, a choice was made to go more, as you say, into this mapping of these climate paradigms and how things have developed. I do believe even there that there is a notion of, in the EUTS case, we connect it also to the legislative period. So you can see also, in particular, I would say from 2019, how certain ideas come in. So then you can see sort of what effect these changes potentially lead to in the European Commission, or in the European Commission with the commissioners being changed, and also some of the influence from the European Parliament. So you can see that connection and that influence, and I believe the Commission has become more political. I think we've seen a number of other studies on that. And I would say, therefore, that the relevance of ideas will increase due to this, that you have these 5-year programs of the incoming president, and they want to present some ideas that appeal to the wider public. The Commission is certainly going in that direction. So I think, indeed, you're right. I mean, it merits more attention, And I think indeed it's an interesting path for future studies. I don't know if I fully covered it there, but this.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Jos Verbeek, who holds the climate chair at the EUI in Florence.
Thank you very much. So Daniel, congratulations for the work done. I appreciated very much your economic and political analysis that you were putting forward. It covers the period where I was one of the actors, not having much time to think about things happening. But when you look at it over, at a 20-year period of time, as you did, I recognized many of the twists and turns that you were describing. So that was very pleasant and enriching reading. I have a question and a comment. My question goes a little bit, in the opposite dimension of what Thomas just was mentioning, and that is the ETS as it is written in legislation, not the emanation of the ecological modernization paradigm, and much less of the other two paradigms. Because if you look at the legislation, that has stayed remarkably stable.
Yes.
It is about economic transformation. It is about incentives for low carbon investment innovation. It is about disincentives towards pollution.
Yes.
And that has stayed remarkably stable.
Yes.
So the provocative question that I bring to the table is, is the political narrative that has changed? Was that not just the lubricant for relatively minor changes to the dominant theme of ecological modernization, because it all stays relatively stable over the last 20 years. And when we are now hearing today about more flexibility and more security and the world has changed, that narrative is not necessarily immediately leading to changes in the legislation of the EU ETS, and the changes that were brought in were rather marginal and not a change in paradigm. So that's a provocative question that I would like to put to you. The dominant theme, as you were indicating, is indeed the ecological modernization, and the sufficiency theme that you describe as emerging under the European Green Deal is something that has not yet fully find its way in the legislation, and may not find also in the future its way in the legislation, because the political narrative was too constraining, perhaps related to that. But again, the legislation as it stands was more belonging to the ecological modernization than to the other paradigms that you are describing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, dear esteemed opponent. Very good question, and of course, you're indeed one of the main actors of this instrument, and really happy you could join for the committee today. I would say that indeed this is one way of viewing it, and I would say even also in this book, EM paradigm comes across even as a strong, or it's still there, it's a sticky paradigm, it's still around in 2019. If you go to sort of the approach that Oliver Pemberton had, where they studied macroeconomic policy in the UK for a 60-year period, the argument was sort of that a paradigm shift cannot take place during such a short period that Peter Hall studied, like 15 or 20 years. You need sort of 60 years, and in that period, you would have a mix of paradigms. You maybe go back to one and one or the other. So I would see more of this period from 2019 that it's a mix of two paradigms. Sufficiency comes across very strongly, but EM is still there, and maybe you have a new sort of, you could call it, there's some call, say, weak and hard EM paradigms. It could be the hard EM paradigm. And I would also say, there I go back a bit to my sort of everyday role and what I do in my life, and I've been working on public affairs in Brussels, studying this instrument from that perspective, working for different trade organizations since 2011. And I would say that something definitely happened. These minor changes, if I speak to my members now or my members before, they perceived the changes to be quite big. And I know there were some studies coming out around 2013 and other years that sort of argue that if the ETS will become global, carbon neutrality could be achieved by 5 euros. There might be others at 15, but there are studies on different levels. I mean, we're at 90 euros now, so some, I think, and we see protests also in France, and we might see future protests. I think we see that, I would say yes, to some extent, it's a market-driven system. But I would even within a market-driven system argue that you get to a certain price level, the implications for industry and others are so high, so all-encompassing that you can argue that climate policy is more highly prioritized than economic growth. I mean, you could go to 1,000 euros. I mean, somewhere, I mean, there must be some kind of threshold there. The question is where it is. But indeed, in the thinking, in the original thinking of the instrument, it's there. But then we don't know where the price is ending up. And I think we're at quite a high price. I think if you ask many, we see some calculations also on CBAM from members there, without exaggerating. I mean, we look at the calculations, it doesn't look good for many, unfortunately. But that debate is something that will continue and we'll see going forward. I know there's some adaptations being made to CBAM now as well, but so I agree, but then also I think yeah, depends a bit on what the future brings. But thank you so much for the question and comments. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Good. The next speaker as part of the opposition is Professor Simon Schunz, who is at the Department EU International Relations and Diplomacy Studies at the College of Europe, in Bruges.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for your PhD thesis, for the presentation that you've given, and congratulations already on your achievement. I can only concur with what has already been said about the thesis and add that I particularly thought that your focus on the 3 paradigms, and in particular the understudied sufficiency paradigm, is very laudable and really makes an addition to the literature. And I also thought that you managed very well to integrate the different articles into a coherent ensemble, just to add a couple of more positive comments to the ones that were already made. I would also like to apologize. I was planning to be there in person, but couldn't make it in the end. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to engage in this exchange now here via online means. And would like to ask you one question that picks up on the conceptual framework, but is also linked to your policy relevant insights. And this question is the following. You also highlighted it, I think, on your last slide in your presentation. So a key insight of the thesis seems to be the idea that the varying paradigms that you discussed can coexist in the European Union. And I would agree that this is possible at the level of policy design, so on paper. However, when these policy paradigms are converted into practice, varying ideas about how a policy should be conducted are only commensurable to a certain point, in my view. So you cannot at the same time promote growth, even if it's green growth. So you cannot at the same time promote the Promethean and ecological modernization perspectives and advocate for a stronger degrowth orientation. Now, you made it clear in your presentation that sufficiency is not only about degrowth, but nonetheless, it goes into that direction and it's an important element of it. So these are, to a certain extent, incompatible in practice. From an outcome perspective in an economy, at an aggregate level, you cannot promote growth and degrowth at the same time. You cannot have it in parallel. So while there may be this ambiguity in the design, that is to some extent built into the instruments that you also studied in your piece. At one point, the EU in practice may need to take a decision on what it wants to further promote. And that's the backdrop to my question, because I would like to ask you, based on your research, what conditions you actually see as relevant for EU policymakers to decide on how to turn this ambiguous policy design into a coherent practice to solve what, in my view, ultimately is a bit of a goal conflict at the practical level. Or to rephrase the question in other words, what would make the European Union evolve into the one or the other direction? So further in the direction of a growth-oriented paradigm, or away from such a growth-oriented paradigm and towards a practical implementation of the sufficiency paradigm? Thank you.
No, thank you for the question and the comments. And indeed, I would say I think we live in very interesting times. I think when it comes to climate policy for the EU, I think many things are happening right now. I mean, and it will sort of guide the direction on the very question that you're asking. And you see quite a lot of this goal conflict, and I think it's been at least handled. There's been goal conflicts from what I could see during this period, that you would sort of, the way it's spoken about certain policies makes it sound very ambitious, or especially towards also the economic growth side. There's always been a tendency to state that economic growth is super important and should not be neglected, of course, and we create jobs with these different policies as well. On the other hand, then, I think one of the clearest cases here, and so I've used it before, is that European Commission's own impact assessment for CBAM, and this is on page 56 of that impact assessment, because I've been questioned about that before, but it's there on page 56. All different scenarios of CBAM, according to the Commission's own assessment, leads to less growth. But when then I personally asked these questions to the new Director General, two Director Generals after Joost Delbeke, about this, his answer is sort of, yes, but in the Green Deal, the impact assessment says that it all evens out and we will get growth anyway. But I mean, CBAM is a part of the Green Deal, and then maybe I would question, was the same techniques for this economic assessment made in the Green Deal assessment as in the CBAM assessment? I'm not sure. So I would say there is this ambiguity that's a bit, I think, can be confusing even for me to see where we're going, but that could also show that we're in the middle of two different paradigms and sort of, yeah, where are we going? And I think if I would make that assessment today, I would say we're going more towards EM potentially, or even growth. I would say the pressure is high now. On the other hand, so I'm going to be a bit ambiguous as well in my answer. On the other hand, when you see CBAM and the measures adjusted there, and I think this is what the Commission is very good at, we have simplification for CBAM. 90% of importers will be excluded, so there will be no effect on 90%. Yet, 99% of carbon emissions are still included. So then you make both audiences happy, sort of. You say to the companies 90% are accept, but 99% we're still on the same net zero transition path. To me, it sounds almost too good to be true, that you can do these two things at the same time. But if it can be done, I think, if it can be done, maybe my answer to you would be that then this ambiguity will continue. If you can indeed do that, 90, but still 99, then this will, maybe this tricky sort of path forward will continue.
Okay, thank you. I think the opposition can be continued. Professor Sophie van Honacker, who was the chair of administrative governance here at thesis.
Thank you very much. Well, also on my behalf, congratulations with this thesis. I think which deals with a very topical and interesting issue, and I think you also showed that by taking this ideational approach, you can bring some new interesting insights that were under the radar before. The time frame of your thesis is, so I will take a step back and not so much focus on ideas, but so when reading the thesis I was thinking, well, your time frame more or less also coincides with the first 10-12 years of the entering into force of the Lisbon Treaty. Mm-hmm. And so that was also a time, and you already mentioned the Parliament also earlier on in CBAM case, it was a time that the European Parliament was further empowered, and some people say really this has affected the interinstitutional relations. However, there are other scholars who say no, the Commission remains very strong and has perhaps even become stronger. So others say no, the member states are coming back with the Council. So I would like to reflect a little bit on, well, because you have been studying the decision-making processes, so you often come across not only ideas but also the institutions. So reflect a little bit about, well, what was your view? Has indeed, after the Lisbon Treaty, this interinstitutional dynamics changed? Has the Parliament been further empowered, or did you not see much of that? Or did you, on the contrary, see perhaps that the member states were more coming forward, or perhaps just on the basis of your two cases, what are your reflections?
Well, thank you, dear esteemed opponent. That's it's indeed a very interesting question, and indeed the thesis covers partially that period also before the Lisbon Treaty. I forgot to comment one thing on the question before from the dear esteemed opponent, and I would like to recognize and acknowledge and thank you for acknowledging the fact about putting article-based PhD together in one book, because that's maybe what comment I want to make. I was surprised how hard that last part was. I thought almost like the 2 articles are published, I'm done, but to get published and accept all the comments from the reviewers, they sort of start straying apart, and then get it together all again in a book. That was a note to self. That's indeed a hard part. But on the member states and the Parliament and Commission coming into the picture, indeed, some of the study covers this period from 2005, especially in the literature review, and you can see how it's more discussions about the member states, indeed, UK, France, and also Germany being sort of late and sometimes agreeing with the majority. And so I would say in the beginning of the period, you do see more this, the fact that the member states have more influence. I think they just come across more in the academic literature all the time. And as we progress in this period, indeed, you could see more of the tandem between the Commission and the European Parliament coming across. Nevertheless, I mean, for example, in this agreement on the 4th trading period in 2017, I would say there was a very strong member state coalition that played a very important part. I would say probably, I'm from Sweden myself, but I say Sweden, and together with they managed to convince Czech Republic and Slovakia to go for this 4th trading period, more ambitious approach, and some other countries as well. So you still see, even after the Lisbon Treaty, how policy entrepreneurs on the member state side still managed to change the sort of policy agenda here. But indeed, for much of the ambitious policy, you can see the sort of imprint, especially after the Lisbon Treaty, you can see this imprint on the new policy from the European Parliament and the European Commission, indeed. And also, I think, going to 2019, sort of outside the book, and how the president of the European Commission got elected. So the European Council decided to not respect the Spitzenkandidat process and suggest Ursula von der Leyen. Then all of a sudden you have EPP in a very dominant position, and Social Democrats thought they would get Frans Timmermans. What happens? The natural dynamic then becomes to sort of get support from Social Democrats. If you don't get the EPP candidate elected. And then I would argue that many of the suggestions, maybe going in a more ambitious direction, happened because of this. So it basically happens because of the European Parliament's increased importance for Lisbon Treaty. Part of the story is at least that, I would say. So that's one concrete way it's contributed.
Perhaps could you also, in your 2 cases, CBAM and the emissions, were there some concrete moments where you really saw that the Parliament had a very big impact? Perhaps do you have examples of that, or political players, perhaps certain players in the Parliament, because the committees are very important?
No, I mean, yeah, of course, it's much. I mean, the most ambitious committee most of the time would be the Environment Committee, and the ITRE Committee sort of holding back a bit, being more growth-oriented. And I would say definitely for backloading is an example where actually the Parliament first voted no, and then those who were reluctant got some provisions in there about more focusing on growth and on what's it called, carbon leakage. So that's one example in CBAM, and it was also a no vote, but for the most part, when it comes to the different levels, I mean, also in the fourth trading period, the Parliament always had a tendency to sort of, if the Commission proposes 40, the Parliament will say 43, for example. They always push the percentage levels, and when it comes to deletion, most of the time, with these few exceptions, the first vote on CBAM backloading, basically almost for all policy, that's the dynamic there's been. And also after the Paris Agreement, I would say there were many policy entrepreneurs in the Parliament who tried to use this to again say, we need a 2030 target, we need to increase the ambition, and so on. So they pushed from their side, and then eventually a proposal came from the Commission. So the Commission has more of their eyes on the Parliament, I would say, after the Lisbon Treaty than before. I think you can see that.
Good, then we can move to Dr. Francesca Cori, who works on European politics also here at thesis.
Yeah, I can only echo the rest of the opposition's congratulations on this work. I think it's a relevant topic, as others have said. You use systematic analysis, and I think both the thesis and your responses today show that you have a lot of policy knowledge in this area as well, so that's really very nice. My question returns to the analytical framework, but in a bit more detail, so not the idea of ideas, but a bit more specifically how you use it. And you use two analytical frameworks in the thesis,
Yep.
the 1993 paradigms by Hull, and then the more recent 2015 article by Ken et al. And these are similar but not identical. You also had a nice slide with the table. Could you explain maybe how you chose to use these two theories, why you chose to use different ones for the two different articles? Maybe this was from peer review, but in that case, what is the added value of using these two? Or so what kind of different insights did the two frameworks give you for these two cases?
Yes, so for the UTS, the reason to choose Kern et al. Was that the study was done on energy policy in the UK, so you could feel this similarity then sorry, I should start with dear esteemed opponent. Thank you for your question. The sense was that this was done on UK energy policy, and there was some similarities there that I could see. So I felt that we felt instantly that this framework was very well fitting, and it also had this level with institutions, which is very relevant if you look at longer period on how a policy is developed. And then, of course, with CBAM, it's very different, because then it's only basically, to a certain extent, one policy you're looking at in a very short period. So then this level with institutions did not feel as relevant. And you're also talking about a new instrument, which basically means if you're studying the UTS, you're already at the sort of second level, because it is a completely new instrument that you're proposing in this policy area, because the main aim was the UTS. So therefore we then fell back and went for the Peter Hall and sort of analyzed from second order to beyond, did a third order change take place. So we say the case studies are very different in that way, and that made us more focus on sort of a bit simpler without the institutions and a short period. So I would say mainly those are the differences. And I think for Kern et al. It was a great tool to use for the UTS for a longer period. We're happy we did that. And we also studied a bit on Oliver Pemberton and how these multiple paradigm shifts or multiple paradigms can coexist. And I think also if I do a second study going forward, I would also focus more. We already have Oliver Pemberton, but I feel that would be an interesting path to sort of continue on and study further. So I hope with this I've answered your question, but if you have follow-up questions, I would be happy to answer them as well.
Okay, good. Then we have time for a second round of questions, and we start with Professor Delbeke. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I have a question on the future 20 years, the coming 20 years of ETS compared to the past 20 years. We go for climate neutrality in the next, say, 20, 25 years. Does that imply that the EU ETS is going to disappear?
Thank you, dearest esteemed opponent, for the question. It's a very interesting question. Eventually, if you get to climate neutrality, indeed, there's no emissions to sell. So, indeed, I would say if we once get there, that's a very logical conclusion. Or you use some other version of EUTS to keep that in place and that emission don't start to resurface again. But it will probably be a completely different sort of mechanism for that. But I would say indeed that would be logical. I would see that as a logical development, because indeed if there's no emissions in Europe, then there's no EUTS allowances to sell basically. So that would be interesting, and I hope I get to see that.
Thank you. Okay, then Professor Schunz.
Thank you very much. I would also like to ask a second question that is more future oriented, but starts in the current situation, because we're seeing, as you have surely noted, strong signs of a greenlash in the European Union, at least since 2023, I would say, and currently very acutely with numerous examples that also touch upon the policy instruments that you analyze in your dissertation under the guise of simplification and various omnibuses. We are witnessing what I would consider as, in the best case scenario, maybe a watering down of quite a few climate and environmental initiatives that were introduced with the European Green Deal. And just this week, this trend has also been vocally called out by certain political groups in the European Parliament. And with your answer to the previous question I asked, I think you already hinted a little bit also at these political debates. Now, without going into the details on these debates, my question is very straightforward. Against this backdrop of an evolving greenlash in the EU and also beyond, how would you, based on your extensive research in this area, consider the prospects, particularly of the sufficiency paradigm, taking a stronger hold in the EU's climate policies in the medium-term future? And what are maybe some conditions under which this sufficiency paradigm would be likely to gain or lose in importance over the next few years? Thank you.
Oh, very interesting question. I think one on maybe it's thank you, dear esteemed opponents, for the questions. I would say partially it's maybe two different ones. So one is sort of the assessment of how things would develop going forward, and another one maybe what the conditions are. And so I will try to go into both of those questions, what the conditions would be for it to lead in one direction or another. But on the development going forward, I mean, where we stand today, if you make a forecast, I would say indeed that we have some backlash here, and it doesn't look likely that we're going more in the direction of sufficiency. It's more going towards EM and potentially some elements of PGU, but I would argue that some of what we see at the moment, I would more use the term that you use now, it's more watering down a bit, and some of it sounds maybe like it's a big change, and then in the end, let's see how big that change indeed is. So I think it will take time to understand fully, are we talking about watering down or making some slight changes, or we're talking about a really big momentous change. But I think this bigger change with sort of more establishing in EM and getting PGU back in the picture could indeed take place. And I think the conditions for that is sort of, it's about how the voters, I would say, and also how companies and other stakeholders react now. And that will need to be taken on board both by the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. And so you have a bit of this economic rationale. Maybe if you talk about the Council, if they have an issue collecting taxes, that's because of lack of economic growth or companies moving out, that will, I think, quickly create a pressure here on sort of watering down further. And then you have individual member states where I think it's typically critical. I think France has a very strong has been strong supporters of higher climate ambitions, but they also have a very strong movement against higher climate ambitions. So depending on how effective that movement is in France. I think it will have implications possibly for all of Europe when it comes to climate policy. And they're also in a critical moment if the mainstream party is going to be able to win the upcoming presidential elections, or is it going to go left, extreme left or extreme right? I think that's one thing that not fully covered in this book, and in my second book would be interesting to cover. This is sort of fringe movements in politics, what they mean for climate policy. And we have a prime minister in Italy that has been quite pragmatical about climate policy, but that could potentially, I mean, getting support from others, like if France, there's the extreme right winning, and also some of the other countries, I think things can quickly, if they change government, things could quickly change in another direction. And also the sort of grand coalition and majority in the European Parliament is holding up, but it's getting slimmer and slimmer sort of for each election. If it continues on that track, next election it might be even slimmer, and they might need to find more support from ECR or some of the other groups. So even if they need to get support from Patriots of Europe, I think it's quite clear that we will talk about less ambitious climate policy. So I think a lot is at stake during this legislative period, and depending on different national elections, how they go, and depending on the next European elections go, we could indeed either be looking at, I think all options are still open here, I think, depending on how things develop, but could either be sort of go back more to mainstream EM, more towards sufficiency again, if many of these conditions that I mentioned don't happen, or we go quite strongly towards the PGU even. And I would even argue that sort of the external developments affect that as well. We have a sort of more of a multipolar world with the US developing in one direction now, and China, and whatever they do, reinforce this further. So if other countries don't abide by the sort of international rules and abide by international climate policy agreements, that would maybe reinforce further that Europeans say, why should we, if nobody else is even... What good is it to be the leader if there's too few that are following us, sort of logic, unfortunately. But let's see how that develops. A very interesting question. Thank you.
So, then the opposition will be continued by Professor Constant.
Yes, thank you. I'm almost a bit sorry now that we have started looking at the future and the larger scheme of things, to go back to some more perhaps finer-grained questions about your research. That has to do with the idea of a technical policy field. Yeah? So in various places in your thesis, you argue that the approach that you have chosen is particularly suitable for technical policy fields. Yet we never really learn what is actually a technical policy field. Is it somehow peculiar in terms of the actors that are involved, certain political dynamics that are more likely to emerge in comparison to other types of policy fields that we also do not really learn much about? So that's one question. The other question is that actually true that the ETS and CBAM are purely technical policy fields? I think there are also quite important and major distributive and redistributive aspects, for instance, in those areas. So would that not also be something that would need to have be reflected a bit more? Thank you.
Thank you, dear esteemed opponent, for the question. I would say that EU ETS is technical in the sense that it's a very complex legislation on one hand, and there's so much to understand about it that I have gotten into numerous debates where we did not understand from which point we were coming until we sort of go back to the sort of original legislation, how it works, and how, I mean, there's different, for example, there's different period when it comes to calculating climate emissions than in general. General, the reference year is 1990. In EU ETS, of course, it started 2005, so then that's the reference year. People get mixed up with that. And also it's about prices and sort of price adjustments. So when you talk about, it's a sort of macroeconomic instrument, just as Peter Hall's study was on macroeconomic instruments, and that was deemed a sort of technical area as well. So it has this macroeconomic element to it and these price mechanisms. and how traders sort of also interpret where things are going, because there's a lot of trading going on and you try to assess where this element is going in the future. It's about very sort of technical analysis that comes into that, like the typical technical analysis you would do on a stock exchange and things like this. So indeed, I think there's a very technical element to it. Yeah.
So can I ask, is then a technical policy area simply a complex policy area? Is that what is meant here?
I would see that as one dimension of an instrument being technical, but then also how it's set up. So I would say this sort of price mechanism, I would say is a sort of technical, I see that as a technical policy area, rather than you have a tax on wealth for 20% if you go above a certain threshold. That's very straightforward. And so sort of I would say that's a different sort of policy area altogether, a different policy instrument altogether.
Okay.
Okay, then the opposition can be continued by Professor Van Olk.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have a question. Maybe my questions because I thought I was.
That's not really.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
No, because you pay a lot of attention to theories of paradigm shifts, and
Yes.
I think that's a very attractive theory to apply in your case. But they do not only pay attention to ideational change, because that is mainly what you're focusing on, but also they also emphasize processes of social learning.
Yes.
And you mentioned that in your thesis, but not too much. And I would like to ask you whether you could make a little bit more concrete how you define social learning, and to what extent it played a role in your case studies on the EUTS and the CBAM. And are there any also lessons to be drawn more broadly from your thesis about the relevance of social learning in times of paradigm shifts?
So, thank you, dear esteemed opponents, for that question, which I'm not sure I will be able to answer, but...
Hora asked.
Daniel Wennick, the time appointed for defending this thesis has now passed. The degree committee will now discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company leave this room, and after the deliberation, the bureau will come and collect you to this room.
Yeah.
Please. May I ask you to join us?
Yeah, okay. I just want to hand them out just in case. But, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Daniel Wennick, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and of your defense in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications. The degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Dr. Anna Herans-Surales is authorized now to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance to Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to take the floor.
Please all rise.
Dear Daniel, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Daniel Orrego Wennick, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, very good.
Should I
Please be seated. Daniel, the degree can go to your parent.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, we would like to still say a few words. Daniel and Thomas will start as Thomas was the main supervisor for part of this trajectory, and Thomas was really instrumental in setting the basis for this, and I'm particularly tremendously thankful for this and of all the collaboration that we have had. Thomas.
Yeah, I stay seated for this. Yeah.
You can stand up. That makes a bit of difference for the people watching online. Please stand.
Okay. Yeah, Daniel, congratulations, Dr. Wennick. It's a nice feeling, isn't it?
Yes.
A great day. Really wonderful. We are so pleased after a long time to arrive at this point. As Anna said, it's very much a joint exercise between both of us to have guided you over this period. And therefore also we have decided to share the duty of saying a few words at the end. So I start, and first of all, congratulations not only to you, but also to your family. It's great that they can join you today. As we say, it takes a village to create a successful PhD, and we know how difficult that is sometimes also for private life, and that the support from partners and so on are required. No, we are really pleased to see this day and to see this achievement of you, which is quite significant. I leave it to Anna to say a few more personal words about your life and your trajectory. I just wanted to say that it is really impressive that you have reached this point. It's impressive that you've taken the decision to do a PhD in the first place. It's not necessarily a natural choice for somebody who is in the world of political and policy practice. When you already have a successful career, as you do, when you already have a growing family, to then take this step. But I think it's hugely important that people like yourself make this choice and basically make a commitment, as you just gave this oath, to scientific inquiry and integrity. Also because increasingly scientific inquiry and expertise is being challenged in the world of politics, in the public debate. We should be worried as scholars and researchers that science and expertise is increasingly diminished in the public debate, and it's important that people like yourself, who are part of the public debate, make this commitment to science. I think it's hugely important. It's also, I think, commendable that in doing this research, you have emphasized the role of ideas. Again, we're in a world where increasingly we talk about interests, we talk about realpolitik, we talk about transactionalism, and so on, which again diminishes the importance of other factors like ideas. And I think you having done this research and having demonstrated the significance of ideas, of paradigms, and so on, helps, I think, to redress this balance, which would otherwise be lacking. Doing this research, of course, in the context of a full-time job in Brussels is difficult. We know that. But I think you've done really well to combine the two worlds of policy practice and academic research. I think your research has benefited massively from the insights that you have into how policies work. At the same time, hopefully, having done this academic research, having understood quite profoundly how important ideas and other concepts are, that will also help you in your future career to do the job well that you do. It was for me a huge privilege to be involved in the supervision of this project. I would really like to be honest and say that when I started, I was maybe overconfident about my expertise in this particular field when I agreed to become your supervisor, but I'm obviously hugely grateful that Anna joined me in the co-supervision of this. And I think the fact that we managed to supervise you together over these years is also a tribute to the very idea of joint supervision, you know, where different scholars can contribute different aspects to the success of the ultimate outcome. It also, I think, shows the success of our PhD program for practitioners, which is not unique, but rather rare. And I think it's grown massively over the last decade or so. I think we now have constant defenses from our PhD program in Brussels. There was one last week that you, I think, yourself could attend that also ended very successfully. We look forward, Anna and I, to defending another PhD this autumn from the program. It's really quite a unique program that allows people like yourself who have the additional drive to do academic research to also do that with academic training and with the supervision that is necessary. So, as I said, the supervision was a joint effort. I would say I played an increasingly minor role as it became clear how complex and technical, like you said yourself, the topic has been. I hope I have made my contribution, which surely was helpful but not essential. What was essential, I think, was Anna's involvement in the supervision. She's a real expert in the field, and I think it's a moment now to also thank Anna, for me to thank Anna, because a lot of the weight of supervision, of giving really detailed comments to the many different aspects of your thesis were on her shoulders, and she's done that fantastically in the context of the many other things that she also does fantastically. So I'm extremely grateful, and again, I learned a lot from both of you about this particular field. But above all, I think it was a really positive experience for me to do this work jointly. Again, congratulations. And Anna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hans. I would like also to start thanking all the committee for the really detailed comments. It is a privilege to have been able to assemble such a combination of expertise, and even one of the main actors of the process that Daniel is studying. And also I would like to thank Thomas for coming all the way for the defense, because it shows the commitment that over these years you've had in the PhD, and all the joint work we've had of which I have benefited tremendously. We are here to celebrate Daniel, Dr. Wennick. Congratulations also on my side. I would really, you should really be proud of this day. I echo what Thomas said about doing a part-time PhD next to a full-time job is an impressive feat. It requires inner motivation. It requires a discipline that is very, very rare to find. I would like to use, as Thomas said, this occasion to reflect a little bit about the trajectory. And let's start at the beginning of 2018, when you approached us to express your interest in doing a PhD, and you brought us very strong credentials. A Master of Science in Economics and Business Administration, already 10 years of experience as a lobbyist, then as head of the Brussels office of Sweet Energy, representing the interest of hundreds of Swedish energy companies. And after some discussion, you very, very quickly settled on the topic of the ETS and the puzzle of its reforms. It was also surprising to us to see that whenever we fed you with a few theories, you very quickly felt attracted to this idea of paradigm shifts. And I must say that this was a little bit of a puzzle to us, because this is not what we would expect, given your background. We would have expected that you were interested in rationalist theories, cost-benefit analysis, the role of big players. But I think that this shows that you approached the PhD trajectory with open-mindedness and with curiosity, and this is something that it convinced us that you were a candidate for the program and that you could pull this out. In hindsight, also going back to what Thomas said, I think that your focus was quite premonitory, because you started this PhD at the beginning of 2018, and when you were discussing about backloading, and it was indeed a technical area. But just at the end of that year, then literally climate policy was discussed in the streets. We had the Fridays for Future, the Yellow Vest movement. Then the European Green Deal came. The price of allowances went up, and as we speak also, that was mentioned by Simon in one of the questions, we might have even an institutional crisis because of the Commission's backpedaling in climate policy. And yeah, then you were chasing a highly moving target all the time. And I think that you need to be commended for this. And as Thomas said, yeah, over time, I think that we became more and more interested also in this ideational dimension, and your work has become more relevant. And the proof of this are the 2 articles that you published, single-authored in reputed journals. And I have to say, I don't know if I told you, but I already saw a few citations of your first paper out there in very important articles. So your work is being seen and being quoted. And yeah, and I actually use a lot your code book with our students in the research master to teach them qualitative content analysis, because students really engage with these paradigms. They can see the meaning of it, and again, they can apply it and feel inspired by it. And I think that that's also a contribution and impact you're doing of, in a way, yeah, making a difference in maybe next generations of European studies experts and policymakers, and yeah, who will be able to interrogate themselves about this idea of climate policy and hopefully avoid the Prometheanism and backsliding into it. So this was a long road. You started the PhD almost as you were starting a family. You had the house move, a major professional move, not to mention a pandemic, and then yeah, all the political changes that have made your job yeah, well, you're in the middle of the clean industrial deal with all what that means. Huh? But luckily, you have had also very special people around you. I know May and Emma, your friends and your family supporting you. I can imagine that now not having Daniel working on the PhDs in the weekends and the evenings will be a paradigm shift for the holidays. Right? Yeah, indeed. But yeah, congratulations on your part in this success. Of course, it's not the end of the road because, as Thomas said, we would like that this exchange will continue. And there are several of us here in the assessment committee and ourselves who work on this dimension of strategic autonomy, critical technology. So I hope that we can keep this conversation going. But for today, it is just time to relax, to enjoy this. So, yeah, felicidades and gratulerar. Thank you for all the joint collaboration. It was a pleasure.
Really appreciate working with you.
Congratulations.
I have not prepared a speech, but I don't know if it's customary. Should I say something? I'm happy to do. And so I really, no, I shouldn't.
You could do that at the reception.
At the reception, okay, good. Then I don't. Okay, I don't want to go against you. That's dangerous.
Yeah. If you want to take pictures.
Yeah.
So, dear Dr. Wennick, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you on the degree you have acquired. And on that note, I think I can close the session for you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Supervisors, please.
The building.
The products are equally important. You go in the